Hi everyone, and welcome to week 6. This week we're actually covering quite a few chapters, but I will go over them, and you don't need to read the chapters in specific detail. Just look at the main headings and the big public health influencers during each of those chapters, or for each of those chapters. This week we are going to be focusing at federal laws aimed at reducing environmental pollution. You will do an assignment to analyze your own indoor air pollution and create a plan to reduce it. Identify pollutants in your own community and speculate if they are at an increased risk for any disease as a result of the report. Estimate how much solid waste you create in a day and discuss ways to reduce it. Identify at least 3 food contaminants and list ways the government tries to reduce them. And finally, describe the factors that can help determine the carrying capacity of the earth. The items that are due this week include a Chapter 20 quiz, an air pollution wiki, my community health worksheet, solid waste blog, food contaminants worksheet, and of course your discussion board. For the air pollution wiki, the purpose is to understand the different sources of indoor air pollution and identify your own sources of indoor air pollution. To complete this assignment, you will use Chapter 21 in your textbook. You can also use other internet resources to review what constitutes indoor air pollution. But what I would like you to do is conduct a survey of your home. And what I mean by saying conduct a survey is look around your home or your indoor living environment and try to identify the different sources of indoor air pollution. How many of them can you find? What are they? And then finally, what can you do to reduce your own sources of indoor air pollution? For the solid waste blog, the purpose is to gain a better understanding about solid waste, particularly the amount of solid waste you produce in a day and ways to reduce the amount of solid waste you produce. For this, you can use Chapter 23 in your textbook. And for the what, I want you to estimate how much solid waste do you produce in a day and identify a few ways that you can reduce this solid waste. And then we have a community health assignment, my community's health assignment. And for this, you are going to learn how to use a government website to analyze information about your specific community. To complete this, you can review chapters 20 through 25 to gain a better understanding on air quality, water quality, and your health in general. But what you're going to do is go to the EPA's website and examine the health of the community where you are currently living. Then you'll click on each category to get information related to your community in regards to air quality, water quality, and my health. Let me show you quickly what the website looks like. When you enter the website, you are coming to this page. This is the home page. If you scroll a little more than halfway down under My Community, you're going to put in your zip code. Now this is the zip code where I live. And click on Go. And what it's going to do is going to bring up data specific to your community. And here we go. We have a map, so this will show facilities and sites that are regulated by the EPA. My air quality, this gives up the air quality index. And for this, not only are you going to identify what the air quality index is, but also tell me what the colors are and what they mean. And then here is an assessment of my water. This will bring you to your air page. Here's the air index, the UV index. Here's the water page. It may take a little bit to load because I'm also recording this, which tends to slow down my computer. Now look at this. We have a couple impairments. Here's my energy data. Let me click on the next one. My Environment Health page. Greenhouse gas emissions. Now here's food waste, excess food map, Superfund, brownfields, right? So you get a lot of data from the EPA website that is specifically geared to your community. So I think that that assignment will be very interesting. I hope at least that it's interesting. And then lastly, what you have is a food contaminant worksheet. And basically for this, I just want you to understand different types of food contamination and ways to reduce food contamination. So for this, you're gonna just list 3 different food contaminants. 1, 2, 3, you'll use chapter 24 in your textbook. And then answer the questions for each contaminant. How can this harm people? What are steps the government has taken to management? And then what are steps consumers or people buying it can do to reduce this contaminant as well? All right, so let's do a quick overview of the chapters for this week. So we will start with chapter 20, which is a clean environment, which tends to be the basis for public health. The government has a pretty large role in environmental health. Because environmental health is really beyond the control of the individuals. Now, what I mean by that is, yes, we all have a role in protecting our environment. However, there needs to be regulations and policies to create an impact. Local government can provide clean water and disposal of waste. As populations grew, environmental problems also grew to be larger than just local governments. In the 1960s and 1970s, state and federal governments started taking on more responsibility as it related to environmental health. Now that our world population growth has continued to grow and is growing, this has led to really global environmental problems. Here are some common environmental hazards: radiation, mercury, lead, asbestos, pesticides, industrial chemicals. Federal government does research, sets standards for exposure limits, and then we also have the Environmental Protection Agency to help us with that as well. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. Radiation is ultraviolet light that comes from the sun. It causes skin cancer and melanoma, which is skin cancer. Radon gas, which is natural radioactivity, it has been linked to lung cancer. These are often tested in homes, in the basements especially, where radon gas after a period of time can begin to accumulate in basements. Early scandals with patent medicines and radium led to regulation. X-rays used in medicine and dentistry also contain radiation. And then there were also lessons on the health impacts of radiation that were learned from the atomic bombings in Japan. If you look at mercury, mercury has been shown to do neurological damages in people who work with mercury. It is contained in emissions from coal-burning power plants in the US, which led to air pollution, water pollution, and the contamination of fish. And there was concern about fever thermometers. When I was growing up, our thermometers all had mercury in them, in addition to school laboratory equipment. Another harmful substance is lead, which is harmful to the brain and nervous system, especially in children, as I'm sure you know, the Flint, Michigan lead in the water. The contamination of drinking water by lead pipes and lead solder from copper pipes. It's also an air pollutant from the use of gasoline until it was banned in the 1980s. Before 1980s, leaded gasoline. It was also used in paint until 1977. It's still a threat in old housing. When the paint starts peeling, it does release lead into the air if the paint was before 1977 and contained lead in it. So younger children should be screened for blood lead levels, especially if they're living in older buildings that may either have lead in the pipes or in the paint. Asbestos is also a chemical that was used early on. It was used widely because of its effectiveness against fire. It was used in insulation. It's still currently used in roofing, gaskets, and brake linings. It's required in school between 1940 and 1973. So any school built in 1940, between 1940 and 1973 had asbestos in it. And asbestos itself, when it's intact, it's not a problem, but it's when it starts cracking and coming apart that the asbestos then becomes airborne and you can breathe it in. That causes scarring of the lungs and also can lead to cancer, mesothelioma, and I'm sure you've seen advertisements for those with lawyers who are looking for people who have that certain type of cancer, which is directly linked to being exposed to lead. And then you can see here the Libby, Montana, a whole area was affected from mines in that area. When the cleanup of the World Trade Center, there was much asbestos in the building, which impacted the cleanup workers and as well as the rescue workers. There are still new concerns about endocrine disruptors. BPA, which is a component of hard plastics that was used in baby bottles and the lining of cans. Nowadays, when you buy water bottles, it'll say BPA free. Phthalates are components of soft plastics used in water bottles. Both leach into liquids and have been found in low levels in humans. They may interfere with normal hormonal action in wildlife, and so the thought is that if it impacts wildlife, it may impact humans. The FDA has said they're safe, but they're now reconsidering that and looking into it again. That is why when you buy hard plastics, they'll say BPA free, because the FDA has said they're okay to have BPA in it, but some companies are still taking that initiative and not using BPA in their products. In terms of occupational exposures or exposures on the job, workers are often the first to suffer the effects of an exposure. They tend to be the guinea pigs of the experiments. And then these carcinogens are recognized when we see high rates of cancer for a specific work occupation. So for example, there was scrotal cancer in chimney sweepers, bladder cancer in dairy workers, lung lymphatic cancer from arsenic, copper smelters, etc. So when you see rates of certain types of cancers or diseases rise under a certain profession, that leads the government to start looking into it to see what sort of chemicals or environmental exposure is causing those types of cancers. In addition, neurotoxins are also recognized through occupational illnesses. Hexane is common amongst shoemakers, liquid dry cleaners, pesticides applicators, and so forth. When we look at factory farms, we see more and more animals are crowded together and tended by this automated system, which therefore produces a large amount of waste. And then they put these into lagoons. Air pollution, including ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and water pollution after rain. So the rain comes and takes all the solid waste and liquid waste, so urine and the fecal matter of these animals, and puts it into the water system and so forth. But when we look at how to regulate this, I mean, it really becomes a political power struggle. How much power do we want to give government in regulating farming and farm habits, and how much freedom do we want to give to farmers to make the most money from their crops? So it really becomes this political tension play. So in terms of setting standards, so most chemicals have not been tested for health effects. There are just too many chemicals out there to do it effectively. And so that is why they call the occupational workers guinea pigs, because the chemicals do not start to get tested until a problem arises. We do have there are some acts and regulations to promote the health of occupational workers. There's the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, the Clean Air Act. But the process of setting these standards tends to be very slow. It does take time to get data, and it's always controversial, because no matter what, when standards are set regulating industry, people are going to lose money until those standards are back up to date. And this moves us to chapter 21 about clean air. The criteria for air pollutants, it could be particulate matter, so small particulates in the air, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, ozone, and lead can all impact air quality. Sulfur dioxide is a combustion of sulfur-containing fuels, especially coal. It irritates the respiratory system and creates acid rain. Nitrogen oxides come from motor vehicles. It's responsible for the yellow brownish smog, if you've ever seen pictures of smog, especially in California area. This also irritates the respiratory tract, contributes to acid rain, and also contributes to ozone formation. Ozone is produced when sunlight is acting on other air pollutants. It's irritating to the eyes and respiratory system. And it also increases mortality from cardiovascular diseases and respiratory diseases. Lead, as I've mentioned, it damages the nervous system, the blood, and the kidneys. It was used in leaded gasoline, but that was banned in the 1980s. And it's, as a result, it's decreased dramatically as an air pollutant. You don't see it in the air like you did before 1980. So there's been strategies for motor vehicles in order to reduce the contaminants in our air. We have tailpipe emissions limits. So when you bring your car for emissions, they test what the contaminants that are coming out of the tailpipe. There is a vapor recovery system on gasoline pumps, so at the gas station. There are inspection and maintenance requirements as it relates to vehicle emissions or the pollutants coming out of cars. There are requirements that automakers develop zero emission vehicles. There's a lot of encouragement for public transportation, so to reduce the amount of cars on the road, to encourage people to use share rides and buses and so forth, and to encourage carpooling. Illinois does not have it, Chicago does not have it, but many bigger cities have carpooling lanes, which is sort of like our express lane, but they're only to be used by people who are carpooling or have 2 or more people per vehicle. When we look at strategies for reducing industrial sources, there are now scrubbers on smokestacks, so the smoke that's coming up chimneys gets scrubbed or cleaned before it's released into the air. There's also less polluting fuels being used. There is a market approach, so the pollution allowance is bought and sold. As you know, like for many companies, they have zero emissions, or they talk about being pollution free by such and such date. So these are marketing strategies that also increases purchases now, so that they have an influx of money now to create the technology and strategies so that they are non-waste producing. In terms of new source review, so industry has flouted the rules. They always try to get around the rules, not always, but sometimes try to get around the rules because it is costly. There are lawsuits. The Bush administration replaced this provision with a weaker Clear Skies initiative. And then there's the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. But the good news here is that there has been a 54% decrease in air pollution since 1970. That is a huge decrease, 54%. California continues to have the worst air population. They have constituted many, many regulations and initiatives, and there is some success there, not as much as I think that they had hoped for. When we look at indoor air quality, most people spend more times indoors than outdoors. And sources of indoor air pollution included tobacco smoke, wood-burning stoves, fireplaces, gas ranges, and furnaces. Since then, smoking indoors is illegal in many places, if not most places, especially at government buildings and so forth. And so if you enter a government building or something funded by taxpayers, it has to be smoke-free. Radon, the danger from radon is pretty unclear. It seeps up from soil and rock, so it's in the ground. It can be sealed out, and as I've mentioned, it's found in homes, so they check the basements usually for a buildup in radon. If radon is detected, they'll seal the bottom of the home with some substance to keep the radon out. There's also formaldehyde. This formaldehyde's used, it's most commonly thought of in the embalming solution, or where they have frogs that you are dissecting, that's formaldehyde. But it's also in insulation, particle board, plywood, and some floor coverings and textiles. It's currently regulated by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And there are other consumer products such as pesticides and dry cleaning solvents, paints and paint thinners, hairspray, air fresheners, and so forth. All of those should be used with caution. There are microbes such as Legionella, hantavirus, allergens such as mold, house mites, and animal dander. All of those contribute to indoor air quality. Chapter 22 is clean water. So we've had Clean Water Acts in 1972, 1977, and 1987 that stipulate that lakes and rivers should be fishable and swimmable. So we do not want dirty lakes and rivers where people cannot swim or fish. All pollution discharges should be eliminated. So people should not be polluting our lakes and rivers. In addition, we've had the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 and 1996, where the EPA set standards for local systems, and states should enforce these standards. So all drinking water is tested for these substances, and you can find the reports and that EPA report that you're doing about your community. In terms of the Clean Water Act, it reduces point source pollution. So there's requirements for treating wastewater. The sewage treatment plants or septic systems. So what do we do with the waste that comes from humans, fecal matter, urine, things like that. There's also regulations that they need to be treated with chlorine and other disinfectants. And then we talk about sludge. Congress prohibited any ocean dumping. So you cannot go to the ocean to dump your waste. And there needs to also be treatment of industrial waste. So before industrial waste is discharged, wherever they put it, whether it's in landmines or not landmines, in the landfills, there has to be a scrubbing or pre-treatment so they're not contaminating where it's being placed. In terms of non-point source pollution, it's more difficult when we talk about agricultural runoff, so the runoff of pesticides and herbicides when they're treating crops from pests and diseases. After they treat it, then it rains. Now that chemicals get put into the underground and enters the drinking system, non-point source pollution. Urban runoffs, and then air pollutants deposited by rain. And there also needs to be standards for safe drinking water. So the surface water, the water on our planet, lakes, rivers, so the Clean Water Act helps. Our groundwater is generally cleaner. And then the community water treatment to produce potable water, and potable water means water that you can drink. And there's different ways that it's treated. There's coagulation and flocculation, settling, filtration, and disinfection. So the EPA has set standards for 87 identified contaminants. There are secondary standards for 15 contaminants that may affect taste, odor, color, or cause discoloration of teeth. There's annual reports required for customers, the right to know about the contaminants and health effects, what is in your water and at what levels. And then the CDC also collects data on waterborne disease outbreaks. The regulated contaminants include chlorine, disinfection byproducts, chlorate, inorganic chemicals, so metals, asbestos, and cyanide, organic chemicals such as herbicides, pesticides, PCBs. They look at microorganisms present, bacteria, viruses, radionuclides, and then turbidity. There's some dilemmas in compliance. So the New York City has been fighting EPA orders to filter its water forever. The costs are really high, and they're trying to protect watersheds for reservoirs in Catskill Mountains. The cost is a problem in many communities. So as you know, in Flint, Michigan, with the lead in the drinking water, it really bankrupted the city, because not only were lawsuits coming about from the lead in drinking water and the impact on the thousands of children who lived in those communities, but then also how do you remedy the situation, right? It took a lot of money, effort to remedy that situation. And then there's new concerns about, now they're finding hormones and pharmaceuticals and household chemicals in many waterways. Many people, if you're, to get rid of excess medication and prescriptions, they'll flush it down the toilet. Well, now that enters our water system. And there's also just general shortages of potable water in the world. Most of the water on the Earth's surface is salt water or ice. Less than 1% of the water on Earth is fresh water. There are water shortages in many parts of the world, including in the US South and West. And the political disputes, how to get fresh water places, who's paying for it, what are everyone's responsibilities, certain community responsibilities. I have friends that live in Florida, in California, and there are limits on how much water they can use. They are encouraged not to plant grass outside and foliage and plants because the state does not feel like you should waste water watering your plants. There were limits on how long their showers can be. They were educated on how to take showers so that you turn off the water in between soaping up and rinsing off. And so there are restrictions based on water availability. All right, chapter 23 is solid and hazardous waste. Before the 1970s, there were open dumps. This was outlawed in 1976. They were burning incinerators in the open, which was outlawed by the Clean Air Act of 1970. And many garbage was dumped into rivers, lakes, or oceans, which was outlawed by the Clean Water Act of 1972, and the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuary Act of 1972. And so we look at now this idea of sanitary landfills. The sites where landfills are constructed should be dry and have impervious clay soils, which makes it impervious, meaning impermeable, lined with plastic. There should be drains for liquids, vents to control explosive gases, tipping fee, which is the cost of disposing 1 ton of municipal waste, so you pay to put the waste there. And the highest cost is in the Northeast. New York City has a huge problem with what to do with its waste. They have been putting it on Staten Island for a long time, and I know that they have to ship out their waste, which is very expensive. There are alternatives to landfill. So one is reduce. So you buy only what's needed, avoid excessive packaging. Reuse, so use reusable items rather than disposable, and then recycle the items that are recyclable, including composting, which is taking your organic waste like vegetable peels and fruit peels and so forth, and then composting them to use them for fertilizer. Waste to energy incineration. There are special incinerators where people can burn their waste, but that's always a concern about then air quality. Coal ash is the waste from coal burning power plants. It's stored in open dumps, often near rivers. And these contain heavy metal contaminants, which then leach into the nearby water system. It's unregulated by the EPA. And the major spill in 2008 brought attention to this idea of coal ash and what needs to be done to regulate it, or what could be done to regulate it. Chapter 24 are safe food and drugs, which is an ongoing battle. In terms of foodborne illnesses, I'm not going to go over all of these in details, but feel free to read them in the book. But generally, we are pathogens that can go into our food, which includes bacteria, viruses, and parasites. We look at the government's role. The responsibility is divided among many agencies. The Department of Agriculture, the USDA, looks at meat, poultry, and processed eggs. The Food and Drug Administration looks at all other foods. The state regulates shellfish, and then state and local governments regulate stores, restaurants, and institutions. But there's this sort of like irrationality of the system as it is. The USDA generally has a bigger budget and more authority, but yet they only regulate 20% of our food that's out there. And it's meats, eggs, and poultry. The FDA has a much smaller budget, less authority, but yet they're responsible for regulating 80% of our food. A lot of imported food as well. More than 75% of our seafood is imported, and 40 to 45% of our fresh fruits and vegetables are imported. In terms of additives and contaminants, the FDA is the one that sets tolerance levels for pesticide residue in our food. Also hormones. Estrogen is now banned for its use in chickens. Bovine growth hormone, which was for cows, is allowed for cows, but it does not get into milk. So even though cows are exposed to it, it's not put forward in the milk. And there's been regulations on what kind of antibiotics can be given to the animals, because I think that because animals were on higher levels of antibiotics, it has also led to antibiotic resistant strains in humans. What are organic foods? And the USDA sets standards for what a company has to do to put the word organic on their box. And what sort of additives are allowed. So this is to prevent deficiency diseases, like folic acid is added to cereals for pregnant women. The FDA also approves and looks at drugs. So all drugs, the FDA approves all drugs after studies have been done. There are new drug applications that go to the FDA, and there are 3 phases of trial, and you can see them here. In terms of food and drug labeling and advertising, the FDA regulates the labeling of all our foods with information on specified nutrients and recommended daily intakes on the food label. The FDA, as a result, regulates the food label. And then labeling of all over-the-counter drugs is by the Federal Trade Commission. We look at the Dietary Supplements Health and Education Act of 1994. It forbids the FDA from regulating herbs and food supplements. They can remove substances from the market only if it's shown that it's harmful. So ephedra was removed only after so many deaths occurred from it. And there are, of course, politics in the FDA, right? So the FDA is still subjected to intense political pressures. Complaints is that it's too slow on approving drugs. The drug companies have to pay a fee to speed up the review process. And there's now complaints that the FDA is too cozy with the industry, meaning like that they're letting people from the companies go through quickly because they're too buddy-buddy. There are too many drugs found to be unsafe only after it was approved for marketing. Fen-phen is one of them, Vioxx, some of the antidepressants for children. There are problems with the way clinical trials were reported. And what they want is a database of all clinical trials to be registered at the beginning of the trial and all results to be reported and accessible to the public. Last chapter, 25, is about population, which tends to be the ultimate environmental health issue here. The patterns of US population, the S curve and J curve, and people look at the carrying capacity. So how many people can the Earth support without hurting the environment? Thomas Malthus predicted in about 1800 that population growth would outgrow food supply. Obviously, he was wrong. Here we are 200 years later. Paul Ulrich wrote The Population Bomb in 1968. And while in some areas population growth has slowed, there are still concerns about overpopulation. So public health has contributed to population growth by reducing death rates, especially among children in developing countries. And so in developing countries, infant death rates were really high. Infants would not make it to their first year, and older people would die younger. But because of the education and other outreach efforts of public health, people are living longer, which is good, and babies are living, again, which are good. But on the other side, population has grown in these areas that already have scarce resources. Birth rates tend to fall as a result of falling death rates. There has to be this demographic transition. There's excess population that settles in cities, resulting in homelessness, shanty towns, and poor sanitation. And there's also some data that suggests that HIV and AIDS are shortening life expectancies in Africa. However, as medication continues to improve in treating especially HIV/AIDS, that will begin to decline. So then we have to talk about the depletion of global resources. So the depletion and the reduction of fresh water for drinking, cooking, and washing. Water for watering our plants and agricultural, and it's unevenly distributed. There are some countries that have access to more clean water than others, and it has to do with the land, the environment. Fuel, so the deforestation, which leads to degradation of land, where land is no longer farmable. The amount of land that's under cultivation is declining, so land that is farmable. And then also food from the sea. So there has been a decline of fish harvests and shellfish harvests that come from the sea. And I'm sure you've heard about climate change, which is the greenhouse effect from burning fossil fuels. There has been a rise of 1 degree during the 20th century, and there's a prediction of a 3 to 7 degree rise during the 21st century, although they don't really know what it's going to be. It's believed that U.S. does have 5% of the world's population, but it's believed we contribute to 18% of greenhouse gases. That number is pretty old. That number has decreased significantly since it was reported in about 2013. China, that has 20% of the world's population, is the leading emitter of greenhouse gases with 24%. There has been no success in reaching an international plan for improvement. And then looking at population control, so the UN conference in Cairo in 1994, we have the opposition to contraception by Catholics and Muslims, but that is beginning to change. Rich and poor countries blame each other. And then there was a 20-year program of action, which was an education program for women that educated women how to have fewer children and to give ideas on birth control to have fewer children. And as we see the population growth stabilize, what you do tend to see is more modernization and economic viability. This concludes our PowerPoint for this week. Have a wonderful week, and as always, please do not hesitate to email me if you have any questions or concerns.